dawn of humanity, gravity has been resolved to keep our feet firmly planted on Earth.
Human beings aren't wired to fly. Whenever new forms of flight were introduced, there is an element of danger to it.
But humans are aspirational creatures, always eyeing the next conquest, pushing the limits of what's possible.
This is all about inches of innovation and progress.
With eyes to the skies, what has it taken for us to take flight?
It's only 25 years since the Wright brothers got humanity off the ground, and now people are trying to cross enormous oceans.
And who were the dreamers brave enough to challenge gravity?
The world had essentially been colonized at this point. So where can you go? You can go to outer space.
Though they worked to make what was once impossible possible, some were lost along the way.
She was flying blindly.
If one thing goes wrong, then that will spell doom.
There were no autopilots. Everything was done by the pilot every step of the way. Only a few people would be willing to take that risk.
Throughout time, humanity has looked to innovate, explore, reach higher heights, and exceed our abilities. But pushing limits can be dangerous, extremely. These men and women risked it all to change everything. On July 20th, 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong steps off the Eagle lunar landing module and becomes the first man to ever set foot on the surface of the moon. And as he does, he utters the words that will echo through history.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The culmination of a decades-long push to get Americans to the moon. The Apollo missions demand $25.8 billion and over 400,000 workers to help them reach this moment. The face of these missions would be the astronauts, the brave men who'd risked their lives to help NASA and America accomplish this nation-building project.
After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union, both ideological foes, entered into a phase of what we now call the Cold War. And this was an arms race in the main, but also a political race, a race for influence around the world.
Space is seen as the next frontier in this battle, and by defeating your enemy in this area that has so much popular public attention, you get a real morale boost for your people.
It was a shock to the American nation when Russia showed that it had moved well ahead of the United States.
The Soviets were the first, for example, to send a man into space, Yuri Gagarin. We are losing the space race.
So the pressure politically onto JFK and his administration really was bearing down.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It was really a demand that he put on Americans and American ingenuity to be better.
The optimism that was felt in the early 60s was palpable. It was starting to really soak its way into the culture of the United States, and everyone was believing that anything is possible.
But to land on the moon, American science will have to advance by leaps and bounds. By the time JFK delivers his speech, NASA is wrapping up its first human spaceflight program, Project Mercury. The Mercury project had, at first, seemed an incredible undertaking. Atlas rockets and intercontinental ballistic missiles were not designed for manned flights.
So NASA knew that there may be failures along the way, and that's part of innovation, but they still kept pushing forward to make progress and to hopefully not see that failure too soon.
Over the course of 6 crewed missions and many uncrewed test flights, NASA successfully sends a single astronaut into orbit and returns him to Earth.
They're essentially being strapped to a missile and sent into space with a 50-50 chance of coming back.
On the heels of the Mercury triumph, NASA develops a new capsule for the 2 crewed Gemini missions with the goal of making spaceflight safer and more precise, expanding spacewalk capabilities and experimenting with new orbital maneuvers.
It's really science fiction coming alive.
The Apollo missions are the next daring step. Within the decade, NASA will need to develop a capsule to safely carry 4 astronauts deeper into space than ever before to land a man on the moon. The challenges of guiding this new vessel to the surface of the moon are unprecedented. But they'll also need to get these American heroes back safely, and they'll need to do it while the whole world is watching.
We're talking about a level of technological change, technological achievement that's never been seen in the history of humanity. And when you consider that these space rockets will have less technology than you have in your smartphone, and yet they're expected to get from here to the moon, you really have to be awestruck by what NASA and even the Soviets were trying to achieve with much less technological knowledge.
So a lot more resources and funding was being brought to the table for these missions just to really try and gain some advantage over the Russians. So if they don't achieve something, this is embarrassing.
It was all hands on deck, using different expertise that different contractors had to be able to do that in the time frame that was promised.
Not only would all components of the spacecraft require testing, but there would need to be a cadre of astronauts willing to face the almost inevitable prospect of technological failure.
People are sitting around trying to work out what kind of training these pilots would need in order to be able to survive a mission to space.
They kind of have to be the pilot, the mechanic, the engineer, the scientist. Really, they have to have a variety of skills and be trained in many things because they're on their own. If anything goes wrong, they need to be prepared for it.
When they're hit with an emergency and there's more than one thing you could do, some people freeze and do nothing. So they want somebody who can stay calm under stress, but also has a bit of a history of making the right choices.
It was anticipated that the chance of bringing somebody back from the moon alive was about 5%. And this was just accepted as something that would happen.
They weren't sure if anybody would volunteer to go into space because it was so dangerous.
Through the 1960s, there is a change in the type of person becoming an astronaut and the risk expectation. So at the start of the decade, it's almost like an extension of military service. You know, astronauts are people who were pilots in the Second World War and the Korean War, and they're essentially being strapped to a missile and sent into space. But by the end of the decade, especially with increased media interest, astronauts are becoming celebrities, and they themselves are expecting to be treated in a better way, where their health and their survivability is being taken more seriously.
In January of 1966, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations, Deke Slayton, selects a crew for Apollo 1, a mission that would see the first launch of a crewed test flight on a command and service module paired with the Saturn 1B rocket. On board would be Gus Grissom, Edward H. White II, and Don F. Isley, all test pilots.
These guys were the best of the best. Peak physical fitness, peak mental fitness. They had a camaraderie, and they really came together as a team and worked very well together. And they had incredible performance when it came to flying.
So the men that were chosen for the Apollo program, they were what were called adrenaline junkies. So they lived on that edge. They lived for the thrill. They got the endorphins going. They were pushing themselves harder and faster than anybody else has. But it's about being the first person to set foot on the moon, a rock that's orbiting the Earth. The first person who does that, their name's gonna live on forever.
I think that the astronauts were well aware that there was great danger to their assigned tasks.
With a little over a year before the scheduled launch date of February 21st, 1967, NASA and the astronauts have their work cut out for them.
There's a lot of pressure on NASA. They have announced a launch date. Everyone is ready. Everyone is anticipating the takeoff of Apollo 1. Meanwhile, they're sort of scrambling in the back, making sure that all the hardware is working. And they're working with multiple contractors, so making sure every deliverable comes on time, everything is tested, checked, replaced, maybe trying to figure out if the astronauts can identify anything that needs to be changed or not. So there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of running around, and a lot of trying to get things ready for that launch date.
As NASA and its contractors work on command and service modules and the rocket that will lift Apollo 1 into lower Earth orbit, the astronauts commence their training.
The training that astronauts have to undergo is absolutely grueling. I mean, it's swimming long distances in a flight suit wearing tennis shoes. It's being flown high into the air and then the craft heading towards the Earth at massive speed to simulate weightlessness, and doing that over and over again. You know, this is something that is really taxing the bodies of astronauts, and frankly, some people can take it and some people can't.
There's a part of the brain, the amygdala, that gets active when you get into these risky situations. And what it does is it floods your system with dopamine, it floods your system with endorphins and adrenaline. Your heart rate goes up, you get more oxygen from your breathing. All of this actually puts you into what some of the thrill seekers say is a superhuman state. Like, they feel like they have superpowers. All their senses are sharper, they're stronger, they're faster, and so you feel like you were just on top of the world when this is happening.
But one crew member would need to be replaced just a month after his selection.
When Don F. Isley has to bow out of the Apollo program when his shoulder pops, I mean, as somebody who's training to be an astronaut, with all the publicity that's going to bring, the life-changing possibilities, but also the opportunity to go into space to do something that incredible, I mean, it's a devastating blow.
To take Isley's place, Deke Slayton recruits Roger B. Chaffee, a rookie, also a member of NASA's Astronaut Group 3.
You got somebody new late stage in the game? That's a hell of a lot of pressure.
The astronauts selected for the Apollo 1 mission continue their training. NASA is in a constant state of reviewing and tweaking its equipment.
NASA then is essentially a massive state-run enterprise, but it has to deal with a huge number of private contractors. And of course, this presents all kinds of communications difficulties, challenges, problems. I mean, it is a managerial nightmare. And in the middle of all this are the astronauts, the people who are essentially going to put their lives on the line.
So there's a real importance to have proper simulators, because really approximations, imagination, discussion just doesn't get us there.
These test pilots had to keep retraining and retraining because they were building the capsule during the training period. So instead, they had a different set of frustrations. What they learned one day isn't what they learned to have to do the next day. And so how do you feel when every time you're told this is what you have to do, and next day you come in and it's not what you're going to do anymore and you have to learn again? You get into a situation where you never trust what you're getting.
When it comes to the launch date, they have to believe in NASA, otherwise the mission can't happen.
At a meeting on August 20th, 1966, with the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office Manager, James F. Shea, the astronauts voiced their concern.
The astronauts were preparing for a lot of dangerous moments, from takeoff to getting into orbit to descending to the surface of the moon. Every step of that is a lot of risk.
They're working with technology in the most challenging circumstances. The astronauts expressed concern about some of the safety features of the capsule. There was concern about that if you're in a capsule, that it not contain highly flammable material. The capsule was filled with flammable material. The astronauts are literally locked into their seats, and the hatch is over there. There was lots of concern that in the event of an emergency, they didn't have access to that hatch. That became a major issue.
And a test pilot has to have faith and trust in the ship that he's going to be flying in. It's not there.
After the meeting, the three astronauts give the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office Manager a photo of the three with bowed heads and hands in prayer. The inscription reads, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head."
There is a gallows humor that they all have, that they recognize the danger of what they're doing. They recognize that each day could potentially be their last, and they don't hide from that.
Despite the questions that the astronauts have in their mind about NASA management, of course, they're still completely G'd up to get involved with this mission, to carry it through. I mean, they are dedicated men.
6 days later, on August 26, 1966, North American Aviation delivers command and service modules to NASA with a conditional operational pass. They deliver their components, assuming that NASA will complete 113 significant engineering changes. Over the coming weeks, NASA will add 623 engineering changes of its own.
And this immediately raises the question whether or not all those changes that are needed have been carried out, whether or not there's a clear, holistic picture of whether or not the module is fit for service. Because if one thing goes wrong, then that will spell doom.
Meanwhile, the simulator engineers have a hard time keeping up.
They really need to run through every single step together to really be prepared. And the astronauts are frustrated because they are getting ready for the biggest moment of their life, and they don't have the most updated simulators in front of them.
Gus Grissom, one of the astronauts, does something really odd. He hangs a lemon in front of the NASA insignia in the command module in the simulator. Now, why does he do that? Well, it's because he hasn't got complete confidence that the simulator actually matches what he's going to eventually end up flying. And also, he doesn't feel confident that he's been given the preparation, the tools for actually flying the simulator, let alone the real thing.
On January 6, 1967, the command and service modules are moved to Launch Pad 34 at the Kennedy Space Center ahead of the February 21, 1967 launch. With just under 2 months to go before the first manned launch of the Apollo missions, NASA scientists and engineers have signed off on the hardware for the command and service module, as well as for the Saturn 1B rocket, set to take the 3 astronauts to lower Earth orbit. Now that the command and service module are in position on the launch pad, the ground tests are set to take place.
This is what's called a plugs out test. All the pyrotechnics have been switched off. There isn't the fuel present that could cause an explosion. The inside of the module has been flooded with oxygen. They are in their spacesuits. The idea is that they will simulate as far as possible what it's going to be like on the launch day, and the communications, familiarizing themselves with the inside of the module, and basically then being absolutely prepared to go into space. This should really be a pretty safe exercise from which they'll emerge, go for a cup of coffee, and talk about how it went.
You're going to want everything to go right, because if everything goes right here, all the other timelines are online and you will launch when you expect.
When the astronauts are aboard Apollo 1 and they plug in to have the oxygen come into their suits, Grissom notes that there is a sour milk smell that's coming through. It was so strong that the astronauts reported their eyes watering. In addition, the communications aren't working correctly. Grissom and the other astronauts can't communicate effectively with the people who are managing the launch. So Grissom makes the statement, how can we go to the moon if we can't talk to the people a building away?
Meanwhile, inside the command and service module, astronauts are running through their pre-launch checklist.
They delayed the launch for hours in order to resolve the communications issue.
I mean, that's why they were doing that plugs out test, to sort of identify those things that could go wrong the day of. There's no room for error.
After troubleshooting the communications issue and taking samples of the air to confirm nothing is amiss, the countdown resumes and outer hatches are installed.
The mission control is also doing a dry run. They're taking them step by step. The astronauts are meant to report every step to mission control.
One person who is still on the communication system hears from the cockpit there's a fire, and immediately starts to scramble people to figure out what's happening.
It's very clear that there is a fire within the module. They are stunned. It's almost as if they don't believe what is happening. And then after a pause, somebody at NASA asks the astronauts to respond. But already that's several seconds after the astronauts have flagged up that there is a fire, a serious fire in the module.
Astronauts themselves can't blow the hatch from inside, so they can't open the hatch of Apollo 1. It has to be done from the outside. So they are stuck in the cockpit of Apollo 1 with a fire engulfing them, waiting for people outside to, in their minds, come and rescue them.
And it really goes from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds.
Finally, after 5 minutes, pad workers are able to open all 3 hatch layers. Since they are unable to drop the inner hatch to the capsule floor, they must push it out of the way to get inside. And when they do, what they see inside is beyond comprehension.
Dick Slayton is one of the first people that's eventually able to get inside the capsule after 5 minutes of trying to get in. And what he sees is pretty horrific. There was a big fire inside the capsule, and unfortunately, none of the astronauts made it out alive. One was still strapped in, one was on the floor, meaning that he was trying to open the hatch but wasn't successful.
It becomes clear that there's nothing anybody could do.
It wasn't expected to happen. And you just see the cost of the people that are no longer there. And you're gonna start second guessing, where was there a wrong decision? What could I have done differently so that this wouldn't have happened?
The Apollo 1 mission never leaves the ground, and it ends an unspeakable tragedy. 3 of the best astronauts are dead. The mission has been a colossal failure, and NASA is traumatized. Families of the astronauts are devastated, while the American public demands answers.
And this hits the nation hard. Here are people that have become the face of the space race.
Initially, the astronauts are basically glorified military test pilots. But things have changed. NASA's own propaganda, the American government's own PR machine, has humanized the astronauts. Kids are playing with astronaut toys. There are movies, there are cartoons. It's come right into the homes of America. And so when astronauts are incinerated in their module, this isn't supposed to happen. These are heroes. These are astronauts. So you can imagine for millions of Americans, this is heart-wrenching.
In the wake of the tragedy, it becomes painfully clear that flammable materials, unshielded wires, and the cabin's 100% oxygen atmosphere were a recipe for disaster. In response, NASA retools its decision-making, establishing the Apollo 204 Review Board as a system of checks and balances for even the most minor design changes. Though the process is painstaking, NASA will go to any lengths to avoid another catastrophe.
So NASA doubled down on thinking about control and safety and scientific rigor. They couldn't stop because the future Apollo missions were so important. And even though there was a loss of life, there's so much more potential and opportunity ahead of us if we push forward with these Apollo missions.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
2 years later, when the Apollo 11 mission finally makes it to the moon, America celebrates the success of the Apollo missions and of Western democracy. But behind the triumph, the Apollo 1 tragedy remains.
The goal of NASA is to ensure that these accidents don't happen again and that those who were there are never forgotten.
As human triumphs in space have us eyeing distant planets and galaxies, so too did humans once aspire to merely make it off the ground. In the long history of aeronautic flights, one brash woman stands out, putting life and limb on the line to conquer the skies. Her contribution cannot be overstated. Amelia Earhart was a world-famous aviatrix, the first woman to cross the Atlantic. She not only pushed boundaries of what was possible in aviation, but she kicked open doors for women everywhere else too.
To get an idea of just how revolutionary Amelia Earhart was in the 1920s and 1930s, consider this, that in 2020, only 5% of pilots are female. 1.42% of captains. There's still this idea in aviation that the cockpit is a male preserve.
Amelia Earhart is born on July 24, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. She is the oldest of 2 girls, daughter to Samuel Stanton Earhart and Amy Earhart.
On her mother's side, it's a fairly well-to-do family. She grows up basically with her maternal grandparents, and she's a bit of a tomboy. She has a nickname, Pidge.
When Amelia Earhart visits the World Fair, she sees a roller coaster and she is amazed by it. She thinks this is one of the greatest things that she's ever seen. So she wants to build her own roller coaster. So she takes wood planks and builds a track from the top of the shed down to the ground and takes a wood tub and puts it on top of the shed. And this is how she builds her own little wood roller coaster. Doesn't work. The tub falls to the ground. She is injured in the fall. but it speaks to how she was kind of a little daredevil, that she wasn't scared of anything.
Amelia Earhart as a kid really does show what she's going to be like as an adult.
At 10 years old, Amelia sees her first airplane at a state fair in Des Moines, Iowa.
Pilots at that point, or people that would take on the risk of flying, were really daredevils who were just going to be in air for maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, where you're not on the ground. That itself was a big risk and a novelty.
And Amelia Earhart is decidedly unimpressed with the aircraft. She describes it as rusty and just pieces of wood. In some way, it speaks to how primitive early aircraft were. And Amelia Earhart, her reaction really fit in with a lot of the wider social reaction to aviation at the time of being skeptical about aircraft and their ability to actually succeed and fly.
When the First World War breaks out, Amelia joins her sister in Toronto, Canada, and volunteers as a nurse tending to wounded soldiers. After the war, Amelia briefly enrolls in medical school before joining her parents in California. It is here that her fascination with flying truly takes off. At a Long Beach air show, Amelia meets Frank Hawk.
Earhart flies with Frank Hawk for the first time. And remember, this is an open cockpit, so this is a very freeing experience. Wind in your hair, you're wearing the goggles, you're seeing the Earth from a different perspective. She also has the experience of an aircraft doing stunts and coming towards her, and she is not scared of this. As other people are potentially fleeing around her, she stays there because she is enthralled. That must have been, for Amelia Earhart and for anyone who experienced this in the 1920s, just the thrill of a lifetime.
She's taken what she enjoyed out of that roller coaster, and now it's 100 times better in the plane. And so it's not surprising that that's the feeling and that's the thrill that she's going to keep chasing for the rest of her life.
Amelia works multiple jobs and saves all of her money to take flying lessons with Netta Snook.
Amelia Earhart couldn't just settle for being a passenger and for just having that experience of flying. She wanted to be in charge. She wanted to be that pilot. And they weren't flying lessons with just anyone. It was with one of the very few female pilots at that point. And having that mentor and being able to have that opportunity was just really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her.
It's reported that Amelia Earhart paid $600 American for her flying lessons. And the glass ceiling is also a financial ceiling for women. Provisions are made for boys to do things that aren't often made for girls.
By learning from Nettis, she's pushing back on society's limitations that they're trying to impose upon her, that she shouldn't be doing this, that she can't be doing this. Well, that's all rubbish. She can. Nettis has done it. She's going to learn from Nettis, and she's going to take it to the next stage and go further, farther, faster than others have.
In 1921, Amelia buys her first plane, a yellow Kinner Airster biplane she calls Canary. On October 22, 1922, she sets her first unofficial record, taking her plane up to 14,000 feet.
She's also still young at this point. And we know that when people are young, we're not really good at judging risks.
She is now in the record books.
In June of 1928, Amelia is presented with an opportunity that will change her life forever. After interviewing with publisher George Putnam, she's offered the opportunity to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic by plane. The only caveat, she will only be a passenger.
It's only 25 years since the Wright brothers got humanity off the ground, and now people are trying to cross enormous oceans.
There was a lot of manual navigation involved. Every step had to be checked manually. There were no autopilots. Everything was done by the pilot every step of the way. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. Only a few people would be willing to take that risk.
Anyone at that period of time to be able to, be invited to be in a plane, let alone fly one, was actually in a huge position of privilege.
The flight, piloted by two men, takes off from Newfoundland, Canada on June 17, 1928, and lands in Bury Port, Wales, after 20 hours and 40 minutes. And when it does, Amelia Earhart becomes internationally famous.
cult of celebrity didn't really exist in the 1920s in the same way. It was mostly reserved for big movie stars like Charlie Chaplin. For someone like Amelia Earhart to suddenly become this talk of the world was completely unheard of.
Amelia seizes her moment and allows her fame to fuel her passion for flying. With the help of George Putnam, who becomes her business partner and eventual husband, she goes on to become a best-selling author for a book about her flight.
Even though she didn't get to pilot the plane, the experience was pretty unique. To fly that far for that long was not something that anybody would have gotten to experience. So even as a passenger, her experience was valuable, and they wanted her to write a book about that experience, which in itself was pretty unique at that point.
These additional funds allow her to embark on many more record-breaking flights.
She really wanted to create an opportunity for women to see for themselves that these sorts of pioneering steps forward are there for them.
Over the next 5 years, she sets 7 women's speed and distance records.
But at this point, she's beating everyone's records in a world that is not really made for women to fly.
And the first few are records for the first female this and the longest female that. And then we quickly see that it turns into the first person.
This is a complete game changer, and a lot of people are putting their money and their hopes behind this. We needed to have some heroes, and Amelia Earhart was one of them.
But Amelia's zest for pushing boundaries and testing the limits means that, before long, she runs out of records to break. This is what leads Earhart to set out on a trip around the world.
This was, for all intents and purposes, to be the last record. So she wasn't going to keep on going until the bitter end. That was never her intention. I think she reasonably assumed that this last record she could handle and break.
What makes Earhart's circumnavigation effort different is that she's trying to do this along the equator. And an equatorial route is more challenging because it's where the Earth is the widest, and you have larger gaps between land masses, so it's inherently more dangerous.
She set a route for herself to circumnavigate the globe at the equator. It's a longer route, it's a harder route. What she's really doing is she's setting up this narrative that the men who've done it before, they took the easier path. They took the shorter route. They're not as good as her. So it's a challenge.
Her old plane wasn't gonna do it. It just couldn't carry that much fuel. It wasn't that advanced. So there was a need to build this new plane, this Lockheed Electric 10 plane, that would be able to carry a lot more fuel to really be able to allow her to go far.
This would be Earhart's most dangerous endeavor to date. But for someone who has spent their whole life doing things that had never been attempted before, it's just the next conquest.
As with all record breakers, pioneers, there is that slight streak of madness, you could say, in the nicest possible way. She wanted her legacy.
It was a dangerous endeavor to go 50 miles in a plane at this time. We're talking months to years preparation in order to be able to do this safely and give yourself any chance of success.
Think of today, where they have the most modern navigational equipment. The aircraft can fly themselves now, where they have all the advanced warnings from different weather networks to not fly through vicious storms. Back in her day, she would have had none of that. She was flying blindly. If she was blinded by a storm or thick fog, I can imagine how dangerous and outright deadly that could actually be.
By 1937, Earhart is one of the most famous women in the world. Best-selling author, feminist hero, and friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. There is no doubt that all eyes will be on her as she sets out across the globe.
She would need to find the perfect navigator. She would need to find someone who can help her find the way as she's flying her plane. So there would be a lot of planning that would go into this. Every stop, every amount of fuel, every little detail would need to be planned out.
In her search for a navigator, Amelia comes across Fred Noonan.
Fred Noonan's importance was he could reckon their position, calculating it with great accuracy using position of the stars and the moon. And this was not just a skill one acquired, this required advanced schooling.
They would have had to plot a course and estimate the travel time, the distance, the vector of the Earth spinning, and then calculate the rough arrival time.
On March 17, 1937, Earhart departs from Oakland, California, with Fred Noonan and 2 other crew members, Captain Harry Manning and stunt pilot Paul Mantz, for a trip around the world. After the first leg of the trip to Honolulu, the plane starts experiencing issues.
So in March, when they're in Honolulu, they try to take off and they experience what's known as a ground loop. And that happens when the plane's direction and the plane's heading are not the same, which means the plane is out of alignment. As a result, one of the wings will dip while the other goes up and catches into the ground, and the plane literally loops around on the ground. It put a bit of a shadow on what was already a tense situation.
And at that point, they decide to scrap it and try again and start over from back in the US.
Harry Manning ends up leaving the project, and that's actually a bit of a blow because he's a skilled radio operator. She's lost a key person.
Along with Manning, Paul Mantz chooses to bow out of the trip.
That is a huge hole to fill. It would have been challenging for Earhart to go forward with it, but given her commitment to be the first person to circumnavigate the globe, she was not going to let that get in her way.
About 2 months later, Earhart and Noonan make their next attempt, setting out this time just the 2 of them. They depart from Miami, Florida on June 1st and complete nearly 22,000 miles of the flight with multiple stops before reaching Lae, New Guinea in July.
Flying for days and days and days, you'd be exhausted after a long trip.
Earhart and Noonan take off for Howland Island on July 2nd. The flight is expected to be difficult, but nothing the duo can't handle. The island is approximately 2,600 miles away.
As Amelia Earhart is trying to do a trans-Pacific crossing, she has to deal with the significant amount of space between land masses, much greater than the Atlantic Ocean, and where there is land, it is very small. It is hard to spot from the sky, and it is very difficult to navigate your way. So it is very easy to get offline.
Howland Island is a very small island, and finding it while you're flying is like finding a needle in a haystack. And now let's say you've even found it. Trying to land on it is pretty difficult too, because there's not a lot of room for error. You have to be very precise.
Earhart establishes radio communication with the ship near Howland Island during the flight, but there is an issue. Although her voice can be heard, she cannot hear any response.
At some point during the flight, with a few of the last communications that was received, they were flying at about 1,000 feet, which is reasonable for today's standards.
That is the last communication received from the plane. It is estimated that the plane would have run out of gas and gone down approximately 100 miles from Howland Island.
Once she lost radio transmission, this was absolute disaster just waiting to happen.
The best guess we have is that she could have been off by even just a few degrees, which would have put her off course. They could have experienced winds that would have slowed them down, which would then require them to use up more fuel.
During the flight, Amelia Earhart only reported her location 7 times. That was less than was anticipated for the flight, and it made it so that nobody knew where she was, potentially because she didn't know where she was as she was flying.
A massive search for Earhart, Noonan, and the plane goes on for months, but the pair are declared lost at sea. On January 5th, 1939, Earhart is declared legally dead.
She had inadvertently persuaded the world that she was immortal. A lot of the American public just refused to believe that their hero could have just fallen from the sky.
Today, downed aircraft would likely be located because they have aviation locator beacons. They file flight plans so they can be traced and tracked. But back then, if you crashed somewhere, nobody knew where you were, good luck, you're done.
Since the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, there have been suggestions that one of the reasons that things may have gone wrong is that she removed items within the plane in order to lighten the craft that were actually essential. And I think that there may be a germ of truth in this, and that's not to detract from her genius. If we remember the young Amelia Earhart in that sled on the potting shed roof, you know, simulating a roller coaster and getting covered in cuts and bruises, she could be a bit of a daredevil. And maybe that's a character trait she carried into life and which may have been her undoing.
Without concrete evidence, only speculation remains.
The fact that Amelia's body couldn't be retrieved or her plane couldn't be retrieved couldn't give the public a definitive answer of what happened. And in the absence of knowing things for a fact, human imagination comes into play. Everyone has their own opinion and their own thought.
It kind of makes the most sense that they had a mechanical malfunction or just plainly ran out of fuel because they were flying blindly without any communication and ended up crashing and perished. To me, that makes the most sense.
Although we may never know what happened to Amelia Earhart, her contributions to the aviation world are beyond doubt. She put her life in harm's way countless times, smashing records along the way. And for that, her legacy remains undisputed.
Through her death, she pushed other aviators to continue, to pick up the mantle and to complete this journey, which eventually was done.
Anybody who wants to become a pilot in today's world will probably have studied her. She will be looked at for the next 1,000 years as being an absolute hero.
Around the world travel now happens without a second thought, and aboard every flight is the product of decades of hazardous beta testing. Where aeronautics fail, parachutes get humans back to Earth unharmed. But who were the souls brave enough to take the first leaps? Would you ever jump off a cliff or a bridge with just the clothes on your back? No parachute strapped to you? What if those clothes were a specially designed wingsuit? Modern-day wingsuits are the ultimate for thrill seekers. Where did the idea of wearable wings come from? One of the earliest and most well-known inventors who put his life on the line was Franz Reichelt, an Austrian tailor living in Paris. His design is an early glimpse of what will become the modern wingsuit.
Any new idea that comes along that is revolutionary has resistance. The printing press had people scared of what the spread of information would do. New ship technology had people scared of what they would find when they went out to sea. Technology breeds fear because it is uncertain.
Franz Reichelt was caught up in the enthusiasm during this great age of discovery and innovation, the amazing improvements all around them with aeronautics.
He must enjoy making clothes day in and day out, but it's not earth-shattering, it's not newsworthy, so he sees an opportunity. Maybe he can make a name for himself.
Incredible advancements in aviation came with huge risks for the pilots themselves. The Wright brothers were driven to build a plane that will travel further and faster. In September 1908, the first airplane passenger death occurs. Orville Wright survives, but his passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, perishes. The need for a safe escape for when a plane malfunctions is high. In 1910, Reichelt starts experimenting, tailoring a wearable parachute that he hopes will save lives.
Franz Reichelt is an Austrian-born tailor. He's left his native Austria for Paris, and he has a mainly Austrian clientele. And you have to imagine that he's there making these suits for his customers, but at the same time, he's reading in the newspapers about this aviation mania, this obsession with flying. Now that the Wright brothers have got us into the air, what's going to happen next? And somehow, in his mind, he makes this intersection between his job as a tailor and the need for parachutes, you know, for pilots to be able to survive crashes. And somehow he decides he's the man to be able to save those pilots.
There had been fatalities, and these crashes happened at low altitude. So he set out to try to design a parachute suit that one could safely use at very low altitudes, like 200 feet.
He's an entrepreneur. That's what we call it these days. He doesn't have the training, he doesn't have the degrees, but he has practical skills. He knows what he's doing. He sees something and he thinks, I can find a solution to that.
By the end of 1910, the maximum altitude reached in flight is up to 11,474 feet. But prior to that, most planes cannot climb over 500 feet. Functional parachutes exist, but Reichelt aims to design a parachute easily deployed from low altitudes.
You have to imagine Reichelt in his shop in Paris, in between making waistcoats for his customers. He's then toiling away in a corner, trying to develop this wearable parachute.
So what he decides to do is take a dummy of a human being and put silk wings on it. And to test his design, he goes to the 3rd floor of his building and he starts to throw the dummies out the window to see if the silk wings that he has sewed on will soften their landing. Dropping human being-sized dummies out of a window is not something you experience on a daily basis, and something that his neighbors and the community would certainly have thought strange at best.
In 1911, the Aero Club de France announces a 10,000 franc prize for anyone able to design a safety device for pilots.
The aviation sector was fast recognizing the safety problems with this very new technology. You know, that pilots needed some way of bailing out without killing themselves. And in Paris, La Ligue Aérienne even put out a general call to people to submit their inventions. And if anybody had a great idea, well, come forward. Well, Reichelt did come forward. He went to the Ligue Aérienne with his idea. They looked at it and they basically said to him, Mr. Reichelt, please don't go any further with this because you're going to hurt yourself, let alone what you'll do to our pilots. So just stop.
He concluded that the design of his suit wouldn't work with dummies because his suits had a system of kind of pulleys built into them, and one had to stand like a bird to make them work, and his dummies were unable to do that.
Well, the only way to prove those people wrong is to have somebody do it. Nobody else around really wants to do it. It's his dream and his design, so he's going to put himself on the line. He's going to be the one to wear this and jump out of his window. And he does, and he breaks his leg.
It may be tempting to mock Reichelt, but you have to remember that this was an era when there was massive confidence and optimism about science and technology. There were thousands of people, some qualified, some not, trying to come up with the great inventions of tomorrow.
For Reichelt, the reason for his failure is simple. He's not jumping from a high enough platform.
But undaunted, he gets his leg fixed, and he's back for trying an even more audacious test for his parachute suit.
His challenge is to find a fabric that's light, but at the same time sturdy enough that it's going to resist the action of gravity as he's falling, but also to create something that's going to deploy before he hits the ground.
After years of protesting and petitioning the French government, he finally gets permission to test his device at the Eiffel Tower.
The tower stands at 1,083 feet, with platforms at 906 feet, 377 feet, and 187 feet. Reichelt is headed to the lowest of the 3 platforms.
Now, he's told the authorities there that he's going to turn up with a test dummy and basically throw it off the tower and see whether the suit opens. But on the day, he turns up wearing his own big, heavy parachute suit. But the authorities now, and the general public who are there, are absolutely horrified. And people try to talk him out of doing what it's clear he's now intent on doing, and that is jumping off the tower in person.
He views this as his moment of vindication, that he will be proven right, and that he will go on to fame and fortune because this invention, this device, will be adopted widely and will save lives around the world.
2 French papers provide a different account of the crowd that morning. Le Gaulois writes, "After all, when it comes to aviation, aren't we all used to audacity and to surprises?" Le Matin expresses the obvious, that everyone believed he would kill himself. A mixture of excitement and pure shock seems to have been in the air.
Reichelt makes his way up to the first deck of this enormous cast iron structure, the Eiffel Tower, and he props a little stool up against the railings and stands up right there looking down at the ground below. I mean, this is something truly vertiginous.
Franz Reichelt hesitates at the top for an excruciatingly long 40 seconds.
People are saying to him, please don't do it, please don't do it. You don't know if this is going to work.
And if he backs down and doesn't do it, then he's going to be even more excoriated in the press the next day.
He just seems to be a man possessed. He's made up his mind. He's going to do it.
And finally, he jumps.
The film footage of the time is truly dreadful, frankly, to watch. He falls like a stone, and he's gone in an instant.
Police rush to his rescue, but they find him with blood trickling out of his mouth, nose, and ears. His right arm and leg are crushed, and his skull and back are broken. The impact from his body leaves a 6-inch hole in the ground.
If you wanted to parachute with any kind of parachute at an altitude of less than 300 feet, the time to deploy your suit cannot create drag to overcome the action of gravity.
Don't mock Franz Reichelt, because he really embodies the spirit of the age, and that was a time of massive scientific and technological achievement.
I think his legacy is one of a romantic vision of the mad scientist, inventor, but at the same time, a tragic figure who cannot see his own limitations.
Franz Reichelt's bravery, and some may say hubris, pushed the boundaries and limits of what a parachute could look like. Unknowingly, he was advancing interest in creating a wearable parachute, and his design more closely resembles modern-day wingsuits than parachutes. As science gives us the tools to go higher and higher, innovation cannot happen unless someone is willing to take a chance. From brave astronauts who sign on to blast themselves into space aboard an earth-shaking rocket, to aviation's early female pioneer, hell-bent on knocking down record after record. Even the ones who failed brought us a little closer to our high-flying destinies. After all, innovation is incremental, despite the loss of some of its iconic pioneers.